then there we go. Today is November 24th in 2023, and people here are participating in an awarded proposal from DeepFunding Round 3, which is was actually submitted in the ideation pool, was the highest voted proposal in the pool as well. So maybe most of the people here voted for the proposal as well, and now be a part of the proposal. That's pretty cool. The proposal itself, it's about DeepFunding Contribution Token requirements. What is really important to mention, it's an ideation proposal. It means we won't launch any official DeepFunding tokens yet. It's really mostly about ideating on requirements and to figure out together through these workshops as well, how could such contribution tokens look like? Why do we even want them, or maybe not? And we have some cool people here, which definitely will give some great help and support on figuring out some really important questions. This is the first workshop. There will be a second one as well. We plan to close the proposal by somewhere middle in December, ideally. The result of this proposal will be a recommendation paper, which will be sent out to everybody. And ideally, this recommendation paper translates into a more serious proposal for the next DeepFunding round, where we can actually go into developing, implementing some stuff, if it makes sense though. So it's really up to you to say if we should go into this direction or not. All feedback will be captured in the final recommendation. And that said, Sean, I'm not sure where you are on the screen, but you are here, myself. Yes, you go.
Thanks, Felix, for the introduction. So yeah, just like Felix mentioned, this is just an ideation proposal around what a deep funding token could look like. As all of you guys know, within SingularityNet, and more specifically deep funding, in the community members' voting power, their contribution and engagement is incorporated. But as of now, nothing is captured on chain. So there's a lot of complex data, but everything's off chain. So we want to kind of ideate around how do we capture these contributions and engagements on chain, what that would look like, how do we represent them in a token, what kind of token. So these are all the open questions that we're going to navigate together. So we have a couple questions that we'd kind of like to ask and get some input from you guys on, and then we'll just open up the room for any questions or comments that you guys have. So I can start with the first question. So we had a previous closed call just with us and some experts on tokens on Cardano. And one output of that was the question of, do these tokens, will they be represented as fungible tokens versus NFTs? Why one or the other? Can we do both? And we also had a presentation from Andamio and Mesh.js because they're implementing a similar solution. And there's a lot of parallels in their work that we can utilize. But they use something like an identity token linked to a smart contract that captures all of the contribution in the metadata. So Raresh, maybe you can just give us some context as to what we discussed on the fungible token versus NFT question.
Yeah, sure. So like you pointed out, we looked at other solutions. One of them was using an NFT as sort of an identity token. And for this project, that would have implied that we simply update those tokens with the contributions made after, let's say, each deep funding round. But we've considered that option, and we concluded that perhaps it's a bit too strict and that doesn't offer the flexibility that a fungible token would offer in the long run, especially. We could still implement the NFT as a sort of identity token. So let's say instead of having a login, an off-chain login in a centralized database, let's say your Sway account, we would have a Web3 login in which your identity would be tied to this non-fungible token on Cardano. And on top of that, based on the calculations, which especially in the early stages are probably going to take place still off-chain, At the end of each round, we think that the best move would be to allocate to each participating member fungible tokens, an amount calculated on the score representing their contributions in that funding round. This would offer a number of different flexibilities. We could implement, for instance, let's say conviction voting, in which you would have to burn those tokens to vote for a proposal or the other, so you wouldn't keep on accumulating it. We could implement sort of achievement badges, which you could trade a part of your tokens, let's say after a few rounds, and so on. So they offer a lot more flexibility. And also what I think is important to mention, in this fungible token model, you could potentially receive recognition of your contributions in other parts of the Singularity Net ecosystem. So not necessarily in deep funding. Let's say you're active in building on the platform, but your voting weight, because ultimately this is about the voting weight in deep funding, would still be influenced by your contributions in other parts of the ecosystem. So that's the advantages of fungible tokens versus simply having an updatable NFT as a representation of your contribution.
Awesome, thank you, Ash. Does anyone have any input, questions, comments, concerns about any of the things that Ash mentioned?
What Robert added in the live chat here, CIP 6042, because so far we looked on the tokens to look already, okay, CIPs, for those who are not aware, CIPs are Cardano improvement proposals, which usually enhance, let's say, more the tech side on all things Cardano blockchain. And we looked on CIP 30, 68, 86, and 88, and Robert mentioned 6042 as well, which seems to go. Ravish, do you know about it? Or Robert, would you like to elaborate a little bit on this one? If you have already some insights on it.
Hello?
Yes, can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
No, actually, I kind of don't want to, because Gavin at DropSpot, you know, they have their own NFT website for Cardano, and he's really deep into these ideas of how do you take an initial proposal or anything that you want to contribute user content to and then store it on chain, but then you want to be able to break it into pieces for sub contributions. So the individual sub contributors, they can also be incentivized and either sell or be rewarded for their component contributions. But I am way out of my depth talking about this right now. This came up during a demo I had of my Fund 8 funded project with him, and he's way above me. He's been helping me out on the Helios developer forum. So sorry, Felix, like I said, and anything I say you should take with a grain of salt, but he's very approachable, and I bet he would talk to you in a heartbeat.
Okay. But thanks a lot for the hint anyway already. We'll definitely read through that. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, no, thank you. That seems very applicable. Maybe we can reach out to Gavin and invite him to the next workshop as well.
As far as the link that you posted in the live chat, Robert, that seems to be a CIP 68 minted token, which is, of course, if we go down the NFT path, the mechanism that we would use to be able to update the tokens. But I don't see any reference to a new CIP. So
No, I think I made a mistake. And Felix, I'm sorry if I misguided you. I wanted to provide an example of a CIP 68 token so we could look at the metadata and then see if it works for your current proposal. It is not a new CIP. Raris, am I saying that correctly? Or Faris?
Radish, yeah.
Radish, yeah, I remember that from the other meeting. No, this is an example that we can look at for study. It is not a new CIP.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot anyway, man. Then on the side of FTs versus NFTs, what are your thoughts? here from the call. If there are. If not, another question on this would be then as well. Sean.
Yeah, no worries. So another question that came up that we thought might be a good idea to discuss with everyone is, will the historical contribution data be retroactively represented, or when this will go live, will everyone start from scratch, meaning everyone will start from zero contribution? And just some backstory. Right now, the team at Photrek, we've built up the proof of concept where we automatically calculate the contribution score from the data that's exported from Sway. This next phase, we're going to incorporate the voting power from the voting portal. But right now, all of this data is not stored on chain. We do incorporate the previous funding data into every new score that's being calculated. But we want to move this on chain, and if this proposal was to become get implemented, what is the community's thoughts on retroactively representing the data, or do we all start from a clean slate, have zero on-chain representation, and start building contribution from there? And what would be like the benefits versus limitations for not representing historical data or incorporating that?
Well, I would think at least that the historical data would be useful for building the test cases like on the pre-production network.
Vanessa? Thanks, Robert.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say I'm kind of in two minds on that one, because I think it would be possibly a negative thing to wipe out people's previous contributions. But I think there's a lot to be said for starting from scratch and sort of, people knowing, oh, we're starting now, and your contribution does have all these elements of your contribution rather than just one will have an impact. I also think there's something to be said for starting afresh each fund, so that people don't get too much chance to accumulate too much.
Interesting. Peter?
Well, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, in my mind, it would be good to include historical data as much as we can, but also like on the like not building out too much based on historic data. I would say maybe be like two separate varieties. Let's say like one taking like all time into account and one looking at the current round only. Like you can play around with this. I would assume.
Thanks, Peter.
Well, I'm sorry, I keep stepping on people.
Go ahead, Robert.
I was just thinking that, seeing as at least people seem to be open to the CIP68 mutant NFT architecture, the original or the OG NFT could be the original contributions, and all the mutant NFTs, the fragmentations that are derived from it, those could be the newer ones.
Thank you, Robert. Fredis?
Yeah, I was actually going to agree with Robert's original comment. To me, it does seem like it's the best path forward, where we take all those metrics that would go if, like, you're debating, or we are debating whether or not to include previous historical data or not. It makes sense to just take that historical data and apply it to the test version of what that would look like and manipulate the parameters. So just using those to evaluate the system makes a lot of sense to me.
Peter?
Also a question slightly related. Are we approaching this fully from Cardano perspective? Because DeepFunding and SingularityNet itself also has a whole bunch of token holders, a multitude, I would add, on Ethereum. We do have some tooling available for connecting, for example, wallet balances of Ethereum wallets, combining that with Cardano wallets. So in theory, we do have some tech there, but yeah, I'm just curious.
So this ideation is around, okay, go ahead, Felix.
I think this is actually a really good point, Pete, actually, in this regard, because ideally, let's say, when it comes to contribution token, it goes into contribution systems and reputation systems. And when you think about some sort of reputation on a later stage, where the token might play a crucial role, then it should be translatable and transferable across ecosystems, right? Like, I don't want to have one reputation on Ethereum, another one on Cardano, and then like but it's a tricky point then to say, for example, when we go, for example, to say, okay, we would have transactions. Now we run into issue because we have to face maybe really high transaction fees in Ethereum, where we have some really elegant solutions in Cardano to keep this really low.
Curtis?
Sorry about that. No, as Felix was talking, I was thinking you need to have an underlying platform for the system itself, meaning the reputation system. It doesn't quite make sense to sprawl across chains, but if it's built on Cardano and then you're just segregating the authentication mechanism, then you can authenticate with other networks like Ethereum,
Right.
Ethereum wallets or Cardano wallets. But then those assets needs to be managed on Cardano, and that is kind of the next challenge. Okay, well, if you have an Ethereum wallet, where do your Cardano NFTs and reputation live, if not in your Ethereum wallet?
Yoho?
Yeah, I mean, I often live in the Cardano world, and it is my favorite. But I would say the argument does not hold waters, especially that there is a bridge being built currently to Binance, between Ethereum and Binance for SingularityNet. Maybe in less than 1 year, you will have all tokens being bridged to Binance. Then the argument doesn't hold, right? I mean, Binance has very, very low transaction fees. So what do we do then? Should we develop on Binance the infrastructure? I think there should be a further discussion on this point. Why choose Cardano? It is my favorite, but is it the whole community's favorite? Or
Robert, now you have your hands up and you don't speak up.
Ja, ich bin ein bisschen schwer von Begriff. Okay, so I like using existing proposals and machinery. And right now we already have a machinery for, if not cross-chain reputation, for cross-chain tokens. We have wrapping and unwrapping, and that's being done all the time between the chains. So what we could possibly do, and also to quote Charles Hoskinson's, Cardano really, because it has the most powerful and reliable, secure technology, should be the layer one blockchain for what we're proposing here. So lightweight contracts could be established on the chains we also want a presence on, like Ethereum. And what they do is they wrap and unwrap the Cardano tokens, and in this case, the mutant tokens for each individual fragmentation. So if you have a contributor like Radish has contributed some wonderful idea about NFTs, and he's now has mutant NFT, blah, 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 blah. Well, if he wants to either transfer it or take control of it in Ethereum, he could wrap it on Ethereum, burn it on Cardano, and then now in the MetaMask wallet, he has an NFT which says, oh, no, you have control of this sub-contribution. You are able to vote with it or get incentives from it or whatever. So like I said, I like the idea of reusing existing methodologies and technologies that are already working.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that we do have at least one multi-chain wallet that users can use to see assets on both chains. So I'm referring to NewFi. If not all of you are familiar with the wallet. It's not the most popular wallet, but it's an option.
Brave wallet also is quite strong on that. But this then already actually leading a little bit to the next question as well. Like when we think about really, let's say, tokens ideally being able to be traded through different protocols, so you could think about what is actually on chain and what is off chain, where the off chain part may become even the more important part then in this regard, and it would be the data set which is able to communicate across multiple protocols. So when thinking about contribution tokens, then actually, what part of it is on chain, and what shouldn't be on chain then in this regard as well? Like, Curtis, yeah, fancy.
I mean, not to try and detract from your specific question, but that level of detail does feel like something you expand on once you get into the project, with a bit more level of detail as far as information informing what goes on and off chain. But the concept of what goes on and off chain is relevant here, and I think I don't know if anybody here or in SingularityNet has access to the Midnight DevNet. That seems to make a lot of sense as being where you can put your off-chain data, technically bringing it on-chain, and it can serve any other chain. It can serve Cardano, it can serve Ethereum, Polygon, whatever, as it's the quote unquote off-chain data layer. I mean, that does make sense. But what goes in and off-chain, that is a level of detail that, are we even there yet? I don't know.
Definitely not there yet, but definitely something we should think about as early as possible. I think from this sense. And ideally starting to think early about it than too late. And then the too late thing then totally blows up the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think also thinking about what goes in and out of on-chain or off-chain also gives you an insight of the architecture that you'd like to use. I mean, whether you're going to use a static NFT or a changeable one or whatever, or not even an NFT. I mean, God knows. I mean, again, all of these questions can be answered partially by knowing what would you like to include or not.
Robert?
Okay, well, I'll make one point. Everyone seems to like to throw IPFS out in the mix. And Felix, I'm assuming when you say content, you're talking about, like, for example, PDFs or other documents that, okay. Well, IPFS, oh my God, I'm gonna get in trouble for this. For me, doesn't work. Like in my DApp, I'm delivering images and video, and it's just, I tried to download a PDF. I made 10 attempts, and I still couldn't download a PDF, which was a 280,000 byte document. And in talking to Gavin at one spot, he made a very interesting point. He said, why not use just standard servers for the content, but store the hash of the document on chain? That way people know that it's whether or not it's been tampered with. So I would store the documents in normal servers, but I would store a hash of the document or each document in a mute NFT related to the hierarchical top level NFT. And that way people say, hey, I'm looking at this document and I at least know if it's authentic or not because it matches the hash that is stored on chain.
How would you deal with the fault tolerance there? I mean, obviously you'd want to kind of store it in multiple servers, I guess, at least. Because you deal with the authenticity problem by putting the hash on chain, but what about if you find out that it isn't authentic? How do you get the authentic version?
Well, then you can start shifting over to Oracle technology, which has built-in mechanisms for doing that kind of duplicate checks. And on top of that, the added benefit of using like Oracle technology is that smart contracts on the network itself could consult the oracles, and that would allow you to do other extended kind of follow-up or derivative transactions based on whether or not the items are authentic and whether or not it can be retrieved from another Oracle server and then get the authentic one. Hopefully I answered your question.
You did indeed. The only thing I'm wondering about now is what service to use, because I do assume that we're not going to build an Oracle here. Maybe we should build an Oracle, I don't know. But is there maybe a ready service that can provide something similar?
Well,
or some...
there's NeoFS on the Neo blockchain, but I don't think that anybody wants to go over to that side. I'm very infatuated with the project, but I think that's overkill at this point. But they have automatic replication. But then when you have standard services like AWS, they have cluster replication, which you can specify that kind of thing.
I see. Yeah, I was wondering about a Cardano infrastructure, but I think, yeah, Felix kind of put in a link there of OrgFax. I'll have to check that, I guess.
Yeah, that looks good.
There's Charlie 3 and OrgFax that are Oracle service providers. Sounds like, though, for the specific information that you need cross-checked or authenticated, somebody would need to be the information providers, the Oracle provider, to validate that information. But yeah, there are existing infrastructures that can satisfy that.
Curtis, you still have your hand up. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
I didn't want to. Well, it's not quite related to the Oracle conversation, but it was Rojo's previous comment about what infrastructure and what the plan is in going for on-chain, off-chain is relevant, and it should be part of that conversation. What is the cost of putting this type of data off-chain or on-chain, and what is the cost of using something like Midnight, if we chose Midnight for the data layer versus IPFS versus blah, blah, blah. There are different cost models for each of those. What are the maintenance costs and updating costs? I agree with what Rojo said. That should be part of the conversation versus just thinking what should go on and off chain. It's what does that take to go on and off chain?
Right.
Yep.
Well, also, I think like maybe to clarify a little bit on this on this question. So the thing is here, like we're capturing contribution or participation or reputation. We're still finding the perfect word for this, but in many different ways. So there's like specific to deep funding, there's the interactions that are done on Sway, but then eventually it'll come from so many different pipelines. So like your interactions on Discord, your participation in meetings, your wallet history, like all different data sources. And then the question there is like, what makes sense to capture from all of this on chain versus not, just even theoretically. Go ahead.
Sorry, I know I keep hogging the
No,
mic here.
please.
But to me, I see two different states of that data. It would make sense to collect these metrics. You know, these are all just parameters, whether you've voted or made a comment on the Sway platform or interacted, co-proposed, whatever those things are that can be considered contributions or reputation, collecting those as much as possible. And whether that's on chain or off chain is kind of irrelevant at this point, but the next state is it goes through processing, right? Somehow it goes through an algorithm or it gets processed. to determine what your contribution or your reputation score or level is, that makes sense that it needs to be on chain. But by having access to those parameters, having access to those metrics, we can do sort of what Robert was saying earlier, having a test net that is a different algorithm, a different processing strategy, and we can manipulate that may affect the contribution score, the reputation score, based off of how it's being processed. So having access to those parameters independently of the system itself seems to be important.
Firstly, I don't have a lot of data about the type of things that would be recorded, and I think it's probably still a work in progress, right? But I would say if we have a well-determined types of things that we're kind of willing to record and the scoring based on these things, I would say probably the logs of these things that we're kind of trying to track should be off-chain, just because it's probably a lot of data. And I would say maybe the scores, and I wouldn't go as like just put the general score on chain, but maybe some partial intermediary scores. Maybe, for example, if we're talking about there are comments and then there is maybe, I don't even know, to be honest, voting, let's say, the number of things you voted on, these kind of things. These would be two kind of two separate things. And then the first one would have like a score, and then the second one would have a score, and all of these are on chain, and then the general score is also on chain. But then the logs, in my opinion, should stay off chain. It's because of the intensity of the data there.
I agree to this. First, already intensity of the data. Also, simply by restrictions already how many bytes you can put into a single metadata transaction. There are hard limits. And also to say once stuff is on chain, it's public and accessible for everybody. And when you speak about contributions, I think we also have to think, and this was a discussion that was taking place yesterday in DeepFunding Focus Group as well, say privacy actually in this regard. We want to encourage people and empower them to contribute, but we also want to make sure that we don't exploit their whole data and put it in front of everybody, and make sure that we're able to protect privacy of contributors already in this regard. I think that's really also an important point, and to say what is actually on chain is the stuff we want to have easy accessible as well. And off chain is maybe stuff I say, oh, okay, shouldn't be publicly accessible to everybody. But so far, this really good stuff, everybody. Thanks a lot. Ken.
You're mute, can I?
Yeah, I see that now. Thanks. Yeah, one thing I wanted to relay, we had a discussion with Ben Gertzel a month or so ago about reputation kind of issues. And he had a good insight about what the purpose of a reputation score is. He described it as a way of defining a probability of future performance. So for this case, like if you think about, so you have to think about the use cases of the score. So for instance, one use case is how someone's going to vote in the future and whether that vote reflects community values or not, right? So you're kind of making a prediction about someone's assessment of proposals, for instance, in how they vote. That gives a nice framework, because then it becomes clear that you have all these inputs that we've been talking about. And I think it was Robert who was describing that, or maybe it was Curtis. I think it was Curtis was describing that it has to go through an algorithm to process to come out with a score. But it's not one score that you're going to end up needing. You need a different score for every use case. So you have to kind of think about it as like a set of inputs processed by a computational engine to produce a whole set of different scores. And I do think if the scores are based on probabilities, then it's also can ground it better, or percentages are maybe a little bit easier for people to understand. And then the key thing there, and because I think a part of what's been missing in all this discussion is how are you going to evaluate whether you made an accurate score or not? I bring this up because we have an intuition about what we want, right? But actually grounding that in a mathematical computational algorithm that you can measure whether it's doing it right is actually extremely difficult. And you can't do that unless you provide very precise terms about what the output is, what it means, and you have a way to quantify that and then measure its performance as to whether you actually have a good algorithm or not. Thanks.
Thank you, Kenner. Robert?
Okay, I just want to harken back for a second to the privacy aspect. Felix, what are the people called in the catalyst who are the supervisory level?
Nowadays, level 1 reviewers.
No, I'm talking about, when you can sign up to review proposals, but there are people who review the reviewers, the watchers who watch the watchers.
Exactly. Nowadays, these are the level 1 reviewers. Previously, you had the assessors and you had the community advisors and veteran community advisors. Then
Right,
you had
VAs, that's right.
But they
Okay,
rephrased it a bunch of times, so nobody knows how we call them.
Well, hopefully you'll forgive me for calling them VAs. But one of the things I always felt sorry for the VAs for, being a CA myself, was their criticisms and markdowns had their name on it. They were public, and a lot of proposers would target them because they were angry. And as I think one of the previous people said, something shouldn't be public. And right now we are at an interesting moment in time. We have ZK snarks at midnight. So what there might be is there might be a community of equivalent of VAs in your proposal. Let's call them the watchmen. And these people have elevated access, which is controlled by, they sign in with their public address to the smart contract. And the smart contract says, okay, for everybody else, we're going to use ZK snarks and say, look, this is the score. The person has proven it's the score. And if you don't like it, you can make a complaint to one of the watchmen, and they have the access rights to go in via midnight and then get access to the actual context and the text of the critique or the comment or the proposal itself, thereby shielding the proposer from the wrath of the person who may have gotten hurt by the review. As Kenrick said, a lot of people have to have scores, and those scores sometimes will be negative, and there has to be a mechanism for people to mark down the scores, but we want to protect the people that are marking down the scores, and then we want to have people review the people marking down the scores. I mean, this stuff is a bit inception, but it's actually fairly easy to code because it's recursive. And the ZK Snarks midnight stuff makes a bridge which keeps people who are wrathful or gaming the system from ever finding out who the source member or watchman is, who that identity is with the elevated access that has access to the actual content that is being protected by ZK Snarks and midnight. But ZK Snarks lets people know that the score itself, the score like Kenrick was referring to, the score itself is valid, and they don't have to worry, without knowing who came up with the score, they do not have to worry whether or not the score is authentic or not. Sorry for that mouthful, but.
Yeah, Robert, I was going to ask, how do you implement elevated access while having a ZK snark? I don't know exactly what you're referring to.
Well, I'm out of my depth at this point. I've been reading about it at the conceptual level when it comes to ZK snarks and midnight, but I have not yet delved into the details. I intend to become a developer in that space in about a month or two. But from my understanding is that part could be controlled by a smart contract, which is the executor of the proposal. And it knows that certain wallet addresses have elevated access because the super administrator or the top level, perhaps a multi-sig of the super level administrators have given those people access to those particular Shelley addresses, for example.
I see. So it's coded on the smart contract
Yes.
side, basically. Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, Felix, I'm assuming you're gonna have a smart contract somewhere, right?
So for example, in this regard, like what is usually always the problem is the contribution and the verification of the contribution. Who is able to contribute and who is able to verify that this contribution is a valid one, actually, in this regard. And then, for example, also referring once again to Andamio would solve it quite nice. For example, you have different tokens, actually. Each token is related to, let's say, your database. In Andamio example, it's just a chunk of markdown files and stuff in this regard. And as, let's say, for example, a contributor, I can engage with the data set on specific parameters. As a verifier, I can engage with the same data set on other parameters. Which means then, for example, me as contributor, for example, I can submit content. Me as verifier, I can accept or deny content. And the role is reflected through a token itself. So that's actually also when it comes on the utility on the side then. And you have to have the token in order to have enabled, let's say, your parameters in order in which you can interact with the data sets, actually.
I have a question, and because I do feel dizzy having all this information, like just trying to capture as most of it as possible, and it's getting harder. And I'm trying to picture. There was something on Cardano, you know, the minimum viable government thing. That was nice. A lot of people didn't like it, but anyway, it was a nice concept. And I was thinking, like, can we try to apply that concept here and then maybe think of a minimal viable, let's say, token? What does it include? Like maybe one attribute, and how can we make that one attribute work? And maybe from that, if we can work that one attribute, maybe we can add others with a very similar system. Like, how would that look? In case anyone has a clue, I don't have a clue.
Curtis, and sorry, I'll just answer quickly to Rojo, but yeah, that's definitely as well, like the plan for this is oh, I think Felix is asking if we're already testing stuff, but no, like from what I understood from your questions, the outcome of this ideation proposal is for us to just create kind of like a next steps proof of concept MVP and what that would look like for a system like this. Curtis?
Sorry, Rojo, I don't have any input on your direct question because this whole conversation has zoomed me out trying to look at the high level, right? And then zooming back in is a bit more challenging for me. But what was just discussed about different roles or credentials that people can have that allow them permissions to view data or correct data, manipulate data. That does exist currently in SSI solutions. I'm just kind of this is more of a question. It doesn't have to be on chain because anything that goes on chain in a smart contract, if it's a wallet address or a hash, that cannot change. So if your members change, if the credentials change hands, a whole new smart contract has to be created. At least that's my understanding. Whereas, let's say SSI, you can kind of manipulate those, whoever holds the particular credential, which can be handed off to other people, may have that access. It does require integrating two different systems, but is there a reason to keep it on chain? This is really an open question, not a judgment.
Curtis, I hate to jump in right, but I just want, there's a point that I want to flesh out. You said that you believe that if a role is transferred of an ownership, that a new smart contract has to be written?
The sense that, let's say, if you're saying this wallet, whoever has this wallet address can do this thing, but let's say that person steps down from that role and somebody else fills it in. They're not going to hand off their wallet to that person.
Yeah, no, of course not. But that's why we should do it via NFTs. If they hold the NFT that has that role and that privilege, they can transfer the NFT to someone else. They lose access, the new person gains, and no new smart contract has to be written. At least that's my understanding. And
that is correct. But You're right. No, you're absolutely right. And just from previous experience, having seen that, you then need to have a protection mechanism for that, because what happens is people will just send their NFT to their buddy, have their buddy log in and do some things maliciously, whatever. It does ruin your reputation, but it's a whole new level of security that you have to kind of protect for, because if
Well,
that
you know,
can
but it's a fairly simple logic, though. Yes, a smart contract could be written to be called the NFT escrow contract, which has to be reviewed by an upper level administrator. So you send the NFT to your buddy, but he doesn't get it yet. It's right now, it's under control of the escrow contract. The upper level administrator signs in, approves the transfer, and then it goes to your buddy. I mean, that seems fairly straightforward.
Yeah, I agree. No, thank you, Robert.
Oh, I'm dominating the mic. Sorry, people.
Vanessa had her mic up also.
I think she mentioned in the chat that she'll be right back. Until then, I was thinking of perhaps tying what Kendrick was referring to what Rojo was saying about a minimal viable governance and or contribution token in this context, and making the note that we proceeded on the assumption that the current algorithm for calculating contributions would be the first model implemented. And perhaps correct me if I'm wrong here, but so we would start from an already existing algorithm that has been developed, as Joanna was saying, by Fortran previously, and maybe move that into a state where it could be more easily verified by any party interested. And I don't know, explain how tokens are how the contributions are calculated, and maybe move them in a more open environment and the database of Sway, which from what I understand is where it currently resides.
I completely agree with that, and I'd love to add. For me, what's helpful, and it's back to what Kenrick said. Anytime this is discussed, having that why and intent at the top of the meeting or at the top of the document that everybody's working on really helps guide the details that go into it. Why are we doing this? How does this play into its purpose? It makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. Because also when looking actually on the evolution of the whole thing, is like deep funding. Most of you know already, maybe some don't. Deep funding actually is a Singularity Net's innovation fund, very similar to Project Catalyst in this regard. Means there are funds available, then community can come submit proposals, then community reviews proposals, and then community votes on proposals. Well, there's some definitely very large differences as well from how Catalyst operates and how deep funding operates, but the problems are a little bit the same, right? That you ideally want to be able to give some sort of solutions on making sure that people's contributions and recognitions are captured not only through, let's say, in this regard, the spendings of monetized tokens, because this is simply already insanely costly, not always the best fit when it comes to governance models, because maybe you don't want to make all the decisions and all the, let's say, recognitions in the same token, because you would always favor, let's say, a plutocratic setup, whatever security parameters you throw on there and whatnot. And therefore, very early in deep funding, it was early last year, Fortran submitted already a proposal to create a contribution score And this contribution score right now is very simple, actually, in this regard. It measures engagements which are done on the proposal platform itself, which means you submit a proposal, you add a comment on the proposal, and you receive thumbs up or thumbs down on the comments which you submit to proposals. As well, for example, the age of the wallet which you have registered to the platform means you have your whole token since years already, gives you a stronger score than if you just, voting round starts, you spin up a new wallet, buy a shitload of HIX, and for example, in this regard. And to make sure that we go in a little bit more, let's say, equal decision-making process, where actually two systems come together. On one regard, it's quadratic voting, which is then coupled to the contribution score. The main idea is really to say, okay, how can we come to a point where we have a more fair, more equal decision-making process and exploring solutions? The contribution score right now, it's a really nice thing, what is already in use since DeepFunding Round 2 and 3. So this vote is added to the actual voting power of individuals voting on proposals, yet it's a purely off-chain file. And one idea of the contribution token is to say, how can we further enhance what is already being built? Ideally, we don't want to replace it, and really say, hey, there's a lot of good work already done. How can we build further on it? And how can we build a bridge to blockchain technology in this regard then as well? Maybe we should have said this a little bit more in the beginning, or a little bit more. Yep. And yeah, like mentioned, I think one thing what it also emphasizes a little bit is to say this token ideally is not a monetized token, right? When we speak about contribution tokens in this regard, ideally we are able to reflect engagements and contributions, but we don't want to, let's say, pay a bunch of them. And Vanessa is back as well.
Hello. Yeah, I just hopped off for a sec. Probably it's been said while I was out of the room, but I was just thinking about Rojo's comment about what is a minimum viable. And from what I'm listening to, from what I'm hearing in different bits of different communities, it's something that sounds like it should be something you do later, but it feels like people want it as a minimum, is that whatever system and token is used should draw data from lots of different kinds of contribution. It shouldn't just be like, oh, your contributions on one platform, because I think people are really feeling that people contribute in lots of different ways and they want that captured in some way, I guess. And the other thing that I'm hearing a little bit is retrospectiveness, not in the sense that you brought it up before, Juana, but more kind of across a fund, people contribute, and there's not this kind of idea of, we have set or fixed ratings for different kinds of contributions. It's more that we look at what kinds of things have been contributed at the end of the fund. We look at what kind of things have been missing. We look at what kind of things have been rare and maybe particularly helpful at this particular juncture. And then we work out the rewards retrospectively. That's just
I'd like to kind of expand on what Vanessa's saying too, going back to previous comments around testnet and manipulating the inputs, the parameters to derive different, say, algorithms or processing. I agree with Vanessa that the more inputs you have, whether you're joining a meeting, attending a meeting, and making notes in Discord, whatever, it makes sense that when it comes time to apply those input parameters, each situation can call for different inputs. For instance, your voting power may care about your comments on the Sway platform and some other input parameter, whereas it doesn't care necessarily, say, about your meeting attendance and so on and so forth. So it's when it comes time to apply those values, you can actually have different algorithms, different processing units that come up with a different score. So I think it is important. Like,
Absolutely, Curtis. Actually, that's how we're building out the tool that eventually is just different platforms can configure different sources, different scores based on different data sources relevant to their use case for when they need to generate that score. But yeah, spot on. Thank you, Robert.
To what Vanessa was saying, if I understood correctly, you meant being able to access your tokens throughout the fund, not just in a transaction at the end of the fund. And this is something that I just wanted to mention that we discussed during our initial call, that we could build a hybrid system in which the contribution tokens are globally pushed out at the end of each fund, but on an individual level, you could also claim them at any point during the fund. But of course, maybe that's a feature that would come later down the line, not for the MVP of the product.
That's cool, but it's not really what I was talking about, but nevertheless.
But yeah, Vanessa, to your point, there's actually a lot of different working groups and focus groups that are talking about reputation and how that is calculated, what that means. It's not in scope for this specific workshop, but I'm happy to send over the focus group for that specific one.
Yeah, that would be cool. I think what I'm saying though is I think these kinds of things, from what I'm hearing, are what people think should be a minimum viable. So
awesome. Well, we are at the end of the call, but if there's any other questions or comments or inputs, this has been really great so far. So thank you everyone for your time. But any last remarks before we close this off?
what's the next step for you as a proposal?
So we have one. We have one more open community workshop, and then we have one just a closed group expert workshop just for Cardano NFT experts and whatnot. And then we're going to put out the proposal, which we'll send over to everyone, hopefully by mid-December. Thank you, Kenrick. Thank you, everyone, so much. And hope to see you in the other community workshop as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for time, everybody. And cool, we can stop.